Ruth Calloway was 17 years old when the town that had eaten from her father's hives for 11 years decided, inside a single week, that a beekeeper whose honey might have poisoned soldiers had no place left among them, and sent her off to earn her keep elsewhere with nothing but a single blanket, a tin cup, and her father's old bee smoker rolled into a canvas sack. She had no horse of her own, no letter from anyone willing to vouch for her, and no reason to expect that a single person in Pine Hollow would ever ride out to bring her back. But what the men who signed the order against her father did not know, what they could not have known standing so certain in their own judgment, was that a full day's climb above the valley, in an abandoned shepherd's shack on the high mountain pasture, the truth of what had actually sickened those soldiers had been waiting, sealed inside a tin box for someone patient enough to go and dig it out of the ground. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what happened to Ruth Calloway in the summer, an army surgeon's hurried report took her father's good name down with it, naming his honey as the cause of a sickness that had swept through 2 companies at the nearby fort. You have to understand the hives that raised her, and the patient, watchful trade that had shaped every hour of her life since she was old enough to stand still beside a comb, without flinching. Her father, a beekeeper named Silas Calloway, had come to the high valley above Pine Hollow 11 years before, drawn by the wildflower meadows that ran for miles above the tree line, meadows he judged, correctly, to be some of the richest bee pasture in the territory, and he had built his trade slowly and honestly, hive by hive, until his amber-dark mountain honey was sought after not only in Pine Hollow, but at the Army Fort 2 valleys east, where the quartermaster had, for 6 years running, purchased the greater part of each season's harvest to sweeten the soldiers' rations. Ruth's mother had died of a fever when Ruth was 5, and Silas Calloway, left alone with a small daughter and a trade that demanded a steady hand and a stiller nerve than most men could manage, had raised her the only way he knew, carrying her out to the hives strapped to his back before she could walk, and teaching her, long before she learned her letters, to read the temper of a colony by the pitch of its hum, and to move among them slow and unhurried, because a bee, he told her, only ever stung a hand that moved like it was afraid. By the time she was 10, Ruth could work a hive alone without a veil, calm enough in her motions that the bees rarely troubled her at all, and by 15, her father trusted her completely with the delicate work of judging a comb's readiness, because her eye for the color and weight of a finished honey was sharper even than his own. Silas Calloway told her once, in the plain, unhurried way he told her most things that mattered, that honey never lied about how it had been made, that a comb rushed to harvest before its time would carry a thinness the tongue could always find, and that the whole of his trade, the whole reason men trusted the Calloway name on a jar, was that he had never once in 14 years sent out honey. He had not tasted and judged himself. This was the standard that had earned him the fort's contract in the first place, a standard the quartermaster had come to rely on without ever needing to inspect a shipment personally. The trouble began, though neither Ruth nor her father understood it as trouble at the time, in the spring before the sickness, when the fort's order nearly doubled to supply a full new regiment marching in from the east, an order larger than Silas Calloway's own hives could fill from a single season's harvest. And the quartermaster arranged to supplement the Calloway honey with a second shipment from a larger commercial supplier 2 territories away, a firm run by a smooth, ambitious man named Jacob Vane, who had underbid every other supplier by a margin that should have raised more questions than it did. The 2 shipments were blended together at the fort's own storehouse before distribution, a common enough practice that no one thought twice about it, and Silas Calloway, who had never so much as seen Vane's product before it reached the soldiers' tables, had no way of knowing that Jacob Vane had been quietly stretching his honey for over a year, with a cheap corn syrup cut with a preservative chemical never meant for anything a person would eat, a substitution that cost him almost nothing to produce, and that no ordinary eye could distinguish from true honey once poured into a Hive. For the better part of 2 months, the blended honey moved through the fort's rations without incident, until a hot spell in July caused the chemical in Vane's cut honey to break down into something considerably more dangerous than it had started as, and within the same week nearly 40 soldiers across 2 companies fell violently ill. a sickness serious enough that the post surgeon, a cautious man under real pressure to find an answer quickly,
tested what honey remained in the storehouse and found
correctly that it was contaminated, though his hurried report, working from labels already mixed together at the point of blending, named only the more locally recognizable Calloway honey as the source, since Vane's shipment had arrived under a generic commercial label that meant nothing to a surgeon, 2 territories from where it originated. Word reached Pine Hollow within days. Traveling the way frightening news always travels, faster and less carefully than the truth ever can. And the town council, meeting the same week, decided, without ever sending for Silas Calloway to explain himself, that a beekeeper whose honey had sickened 40 soldiers could not be permitted to keep selling to anyone in the valley, and issued an order that his hives be quarantined, and his trade suspended pending a formal army inquiry that might take the better part of a year to even begin. Silas Calloway, faced with a family that could not eat on a suspended trade for a year, arranged, through a distant cousin of her mother's, for Ruth to go work as a hired girl in a town 3 days east until the inquiry cleared his name, a plan that asked her to leave with almost nothing, since whatever little the family had left needed to stretch to cover her father through the coming winter. Ruth did not argue because she understood, watching her father's hands shake slightly as he counted out what little he could spare her, that her own protest would only add weight to a burden he was already struggling to carry, and she packed a single blanket, a tin cup, and her father's old bee smoker into a small canvas sack and set out, not east toward the cousin's town, but up, into the high meadows where her father's hives still stood untended, because she could not make herself leave the valley without first walking the mountain one final time. She climbed for the better part of a day, following the same trail her father had carried her along as an infant, through stands of spruce and open wildflower meadow gone gold and violet with late summer bloom, and as evening came on she found, higher than she had ever climbed before, a small stone and timber shack tucked against a rock outcropping, built long ago by some shepherd who had once summered flocks on that high pasture, the door hanging loose on a leather hinge gone stiff with age, and inside, the air was thin and cold and smelled of dust and old wool. She built a small fire that night from dry brush gathered near the door, and in the morning, restless and cold, she began, mostly out of habit, to clear the small room, and it was while shifting a flat stone near the hearth that she felt it give a hollow answer beneath her hand, the same particular unevenness her father had taught her to notice in a comb that had been rushed or tampered with, a wrongness she had simply learned over years at his side to feel for in anything at all. She worked the stone free with the edge of her father's smoker tool, and beneath it, in a shallow cavity lined with oiled cloth, she found a small tin box, and inside it, wrapped against the damp, a bundle of papers, and on top of them a letter, its ink faded but its careful hand still legible, addressed to whoever might one day find this place. The letter had been written by a former army chemist named Dr. Emery Slate, who explained in a hand-grown urgent as it went on that he had been assigned the previous summer to test a sample of Jacob Vane's honey before it was approved for army purchase, and had discovered, through careful analysis, the cheap syrup and dangerous preservative Vane had cut it with, a finding he had reported plainly to his superiors, only to be told within days that his post was being eliminated as an economy measure, and his findings quietly set aside, because Vane, it turned out, held a private financial understanding with the very officer overseeing the procurement contract. Slate wrote that he had refused a payment offered to simply forget what he had found, and that his dismissal had followed within the month. His warning buried before anyone with the authority to act on it ever saw it, and that before the season turned and the high passes closed for winter, he had climbed one last time to the shack, where he had once summered as a boy shepherding for his uncle, to leave the proof somewhere he trusted, in the hope that some future soul might carry it further than he had been allowed to. Beneath the letter, Ruth found Slate's original written analysis, dated and detailed in a chemist's precise hand, describing exactly the substitution he had found. And beneath that, a final folded document, a sworn statement prepared before a notary in the territorial capital, naming both Jacob Vane and the procurement officer who had protected him, a statement that had waited in the ground for nearly a year because no one investigating a sickness at the fort had ever thought to search for a dismissed chemist's testimony instead of the nearest, most convenient name to blame. Ruth sat a long while in the cold shack with the papers across her knees, and she understood, with the same steady patience her father had spent years teaching her to bring to a hive, that she was holding the one proof capable of clearing his name entirely. In the morning, she wrapped the papers back into their oiled cloth, tucked the tin box beneath her arm alongside her father's smoker, and walked not toward the cousin's town, but down the mountain and on toward the fort itself, where she presented herself, travel-worn but resolute, to the post-surgeon who had written the original report, a man named Dr. Whitlock, who examined Slate's analysis and sworn statement for the better part of an afternoon, before telling her plainly that findings this precise would very likely reopen the entire inquiry. Word of what the beekeeper's daughter had carried down from the high pasture traveled through the fort and into Pine Hollow within the same week. And within a month, the Army had summoned Dr. Slate himself, found teaching at a small college 2 states east, to testify formally, and had severed its contract with Jacob Vane, whose business collapsed within the season, once word of the adulteration reached his other buyers, and the procurement officer who had protected him was quietly relieved of his post. The town council, faced with a sworn army finding that named Vane's honey, and not Calloway's, lifted the quarantine on Silas Calloway's hives within the same season, and the fort, in a gesture Silas Calloway had not expected, renewed its contract with him alone, doubling its value, so that the following spring, Ruth Calloway walked the high meadows beside her father once more, tending hives that were, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and only their own. Ruth Calloway was 17 years old, and in the summer, a false report took her father's good name down with it. She had climbed alone into the high country, with nothing but a blanket, a tin cup, and her father's old smoker, meaning only to say goodbye to the mountain before leaving it behind. And beneath a shepherd's hearthstone nobody remembered, she had found not gold, but the plain, patient truth that had been waiting sealed and sound, for someone willing to climb high enough to bring it back down. It was the best climb she ever made. If this story stayed with you, if you sat inside that cold shack with Ruth, while the morning light moved across Dr. Slate's careful hand, take a moment before you go and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And tell us, too, about the person in your own life who taught you to trust your own steady hands over a stranger's hurried judgment. Threndal Stories tells the quiet, unwritten stories of the American frontier, the ones history left out, about the people who were counted out and came back anyway. Subscribe to keep walking this road with us, because the next quiet frontier tale is already waiting.